I awoke to a strange light filling my bedroom. It wasn't the warm, familiar glow of the streetlight outside. This was different. Cold, unnatural. Panic immediately set in as I carefully scanned the room, my heart racing. The shadows on the wall were twisted and strange, like something out of a horror movie. They flickered and warped, making me feel like there was something or someone hiding just beyond my sight. I could feel my breath quicken, but I didn't want to move. I lay frozen in bed, blankets clutched tightly around me as if they were some kind of shield. I pulled the covers over my head, hoping the darkness under the blanket would shield me from whatever was casting those unnatural shapes. But the fear was already there, gnawing at me. I could feel my mind racing, creating images of what could be lurking in the shadows, watching me, waiting. Wait, was that tapping on the window? My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained to hear any other sound, any hint that something was in the room with me. Of course there was nothing there. Was there? But in that moment, it felt as real as anything I'd ever experienced. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, moving, stretching. My imagination filled in the gaps with things too terrifying to name. That night was just the beginning. The lack of sleep, the absolute fear. I swore I had seen things outside, looking back through the window. I could never prove it, but sometimes I'd catch a fleeting glimpse, just a pale shape, disappearing before I could get a better look. I'd lie awake in bed for hours after that, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to look out the window again. You see, this wasn't a one-time thing for me. This fear, this obsession, it consumed me for years. This story was recently shared with me by a man named Darren. This story is about when Darren's interest in the paranormal became obsessive. Back in the late 80s, Darren started to go down a rabbit hole looking into a particular subject. And if you stick around until the end, you will hear the shocking reveal of just how far this obsession took him. For a few years when I was a kid, I was completely obsessed with aliens. Well, at least the idea of them. I was around 8 years old and sci-fi movies were my life. The movies in the original Star Wars trilogy were my favourites. I just loved the thought of meeting beings from another world, maybe even seeing a distant planet one day. Hey, a kid can dream. I had an interest in astronomy around the same age too, which likely fit into this other strange but intriguing interest I had. But it wasn't like I was a total recluse or anything. I was a normal kid too. I'd hang out with my friends, spend hours playing video games, or just ride around the neighbourhood on my bike until it got dark. Still, there was always that pull towards the unknown, the paranormal. Even when I was younger, I had a fascination with things that couldn't be explained. But around this time, that interest kicked into overdrive. My innocent fascination became something darker, something more obsessive. One night, something happened that I'll never forget. We had just gotten home from my uncle's place and it was super late. While my parents were busy putting my little brother and sister to bed, I was sitting in the lounge. On the coffee table, there was this magazine. I think it was one of Mum's, but I don't really remember. Anyway, I wouldn't usually care about that kind of thing, but I remember it had this feature on alien abductions. That grabbed my attention right away. Curiosity took over and I started flipping through the pages until I reached the section about aliens. That's when I saw it for the first time, an artist's depiction of an alien, or a grey as we might call them now. Those big black eyes, the pale bald head, the tiny slit for a mouth. It looked so cold, so detached. It terrified me way more than any monster from the movies. Now I look at such an image and laugh, but back then it triggered something in my fight or flight response. I kept reading the accounts of alien abductions and I was hooked. Scared out of my mind, but hooked. One story described a white face at a bedroom window, staring in at night. That detail freaked me out. I put the magazine down immediately and tried not to look at our dining room window. The curtains were wide open, and I was silently annoyed at whoever didn't close them. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind outside sent me spiraling, convinced that something was there. From that moment, I became completely fixated on alien abduction stories and UFO sightings. It didn't help that in the early 90s, we had all these mystery shows and news features on the topic. For a while, the coverage was relentless. Or so my memory of being an 8-year-old would have me believe. It was such a creepy thing to see on a television, like some sci-fi or horror movie come to life. I thought even as a kid that I could figure out the truth. I started searching for books in the library, sneaking in movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind late at night when my parents weren't aware. My friends and I talked about the subject constantly. We tried to outdo each other with stories we found in books or on TV, and it was a competition of who could be scared the most. We lie on our beds during sleepovers, staring at the ceiling, daring each other to stay up late at night. It sounds silly now, but back then, it was a big deal. The obsession wasn't always the centre of my world, but it was always there, creeping in the background. It messed with my sleep big time. My parents noticed, but I didn't really want to admit I feared aliens, or at least the very concept of them. I mean, that's embarrassing, right? I'd tell them I stayed up too late watching TV, which only made things worse because my dad ended up taking the TV out of our room. In hindsight, that was probably a good thing. I think my pride really didn't help my situation either. At times, when it was dark, I'd catch glimpses of movement outside when walking past one of the windows at home. Looking back, it was probably the reflection of the TV, but at the time you couldn't convince me otherwise. When in bed, I'd swear I'd see a quick glimpse of a pale face looking in with detached interest. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd convince myself I'd seen the movement of a small being quickly walking past a window, off to observe its next potential science experiment. It really didn't help that my imagination was incredibly vivid at such a young age. My fear got so bad that I couldn't even look at a window after dark, even if the curtains were closed. Then around the age of 10, we had this big class project. We had to pick our own topics and guess what I chose. Aliens, of course. Looking back, it was probably the worst thing I could have done. I threw myself into researching alien encounters and abductions, consuming anything I could find. But every night, after working on the project, I'd lie awake in bed, feeling both proud and terrified at the same time. For context, our bedroom was at the back of the house, and to get there, I had to walk through a playroom that had these huge windows overlooking our backyard. And of course, there were no curtains. Every night, I'd sprint to my room, desperately avoiding looking outside, while my younger brother, who didn't have the same fears, just thought I was being ridiculous. It's not like I would have ever admitted what fueled my fears. And that's the thing. I was good at hiding things as a kid, especially when my pride was at stake. Anytime my parents asked me if something was wrong, they'd get the usual blunt nothing in response. Now that I'm a parent myself, I can understand how annoying that response is. Do I think my parents would have judged me for fearing aliens? No, not really. But I've always been incredibly accomplished at judging myself. It wasn't until I started my alien project for school that my parents caught on to what was causing all my sleepless nights. And when they finally figured it out, the problem was solved for me. Looking back now, I'm actually grateful for that. To continue my story, my sleep got worse and worse during that time, and Mum started to get really concerned. She tried supporting me with the project, I'm sure secretly hoping I'd drop the whole alien thing once it was over. Well, that's when things got weirder. One night I woke up to find both my parents standing over me, clearly worried. I had no idea what was going on. Apparently they had found me sleepwalking in the backyard. They didn't tell me this right away, but a couple of nights later it happened again. I vaguely remember my dad walking me back inside, saying something about how this needed to stop. The third time it happened was the scariest, though I don't remember it at all. My dad had gotten up to get a glass of water in the middle of the night, and when he looked out the kitchen window he saw a dark figure standing still in the backyard. At first it scared him, but then he realised it was me. He unlocked the door, which was something he didn't have to do the previous times, and rushed outside to find me standing there, staring up at the sky. When he tried to talk to me, I mumbled something like, "I'm waiting for them to come back." The back door still being locked was one thing, but saying this apparently really shook him. After that, the alien talk was banned in our house. I finished the school project and presented it to my class. Let's just say I got mixed reactions and was likely labelled the weird kid after that. I didn't think much of it until I found out my sleepwalking and unsettling behaviour had completely freaked out my parents. The topic became too personal and I was done with it. For a while I couldn't shake the feeling that the stories were real, that they were real, and that one day they would come for me too. Maybe they did, if only in my mind. I've never actually seen a UFO or even an alien, at least not that I'm aware of. But it just goes to show how much something can mess with your mind. As a kid, I was obsessed with proving that aliens were real, and it took me down an unsettling path. Maybe I'm reaching, but this sort of behaviour reminds me of how some people can latch onto a conspiracy theory and not let go, often to the detriment of themselves and those around them. Looking back now, I can safely say my obsession has calmed down. As an adult, I'd say I'm even skeptical of UFO sightings. Well, I guess we are meant to call them UAPs now. Or even abductions. I can even look out a window at night without freaking out. Well, most of the time. But every now and then, that little part of me, that kid who was convinced otherworldly visitors were watching, comes back. I still wonder about those nights. Maybe I was just a sleep-deprived kid with an overactive imagination. Or maybe something more was going on. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. As always, let me know in the comments below what you thought about this video. Feel free to share your thoughts or similar experiences with something you also became obsessed with. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next scary, strange, or unsettling tale.